Welcome back to the heroes of the faith who were called by God twice. So far we've looked at several well-known heroes of the Bible, some in the Old Testament, some in the New, who God called their name twice to get their attention. God called their name twice in succession because when he wanted to say something, he wanted to make sure they heard it. So far we have looked at Abraham, we've looked at Moses, we've looked at Jacob. Those are all in the Old Testament. Then we've looked at Martha and Peter and Saul from the New Testament. Today will be the last one in the Old Testament, and it's the calling of a prophet. One that you might know by name. But this prophet was called at a very young age. Of course, we're talking about the prophet Samuel, the firstborn son of Hannah, who was just a faithful wife who went up to the temple year after year after year, praying that God would give her a son. And then God gives her the son, and immediately she dedicates him to the Lord. So here we have Samuel, who's 7, 8 years old, and he's sleeping. And it's at this time that God calls him. And the Lord called Samuel again the third time. So he arose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you did call me." Then Eli perceived that the Lord had called the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go, lie down, and it shall be, if he calls you, that you must say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant hears.'" So Samuel went and laid down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood and called as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel answered, "Speak, for your servant hears." Then the Lord said to Samuel, "Behold, I will do something in Israel, at which both ears of everyone who hears it will tingle." Right away in this story, we see that God wanted Samuel's attention right from the beginning. At first, he calls his name once. Samuel hears his name called. He rushes out of bed, runs to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me. What's up?" Eli says, "I didn't call you. Go back to bed." So he does. And then God calls him again. "Samuel." Again, Samuel wakes up, runs to Eli and says, "Here I am. You called me." And Eli said, "No, I didn't. Go to bed." And then a third time, God calls him, "Samuel." Samuel jumps out of bed, runs to Eli again, says, "Here I am. You called me." And it's at this time that Eli realizes what's happening. Eli, of course, is the priest in the temple. He's Samuel's mentor and the one who will be teaching him the things of God. And it takes him 3 times of God calling Samuel for him to realize what's happening. So after the third time, after Samuel has rushed into his room 3 times that night, believing that he called him, Eli says to him, "You're hearing the voice of God. Go back to bed, and if he calls you again, respond, 'Speak, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel goes back to bed, and God calls, "Samuel, Samuel." And he wakes up and says, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." It took him a few times to hear God's voice, only because he had never heard it before. He was young. He was not even 10 years old, and yet he already had a call of God on his life. From his birth, his parents knew that he would be special. So when God called him, naturally, he goes to the person who would normally call his name, to the one physically there, who would call for him no matter the time. And Samuel would respond by saying, "Here I am, call me." But God's call was enough to wake him up out of his sleep, revive the word of God that had been dormant for quite some time in the nation. And he speaks a prophecy regarding Eli, his sons, and the nation that they lead. When God calls us, sometimes he just has to call our name once. We get up, we hear what we have to do, and we go. Sometimes, through no fault of our own, it just takes a few times. Sometimes we don't hear it the first time. Or we do, but we don't know the voice of God. We haven't sat in his presence, meditating on the word, listening for his voice. And when the time comes, we don't recognize it. As we finish this series, as we finish this selection of people who God called twice, let's stop for just a moment and listen. Listen for the sound of God's voice. Listen to the point that when he speaks, there's no doubt that it was him. Sometimes our minds can play tricks on us, or just confuse us, or whenever God speaks, sometimes we write it off as, it's just a passing thought in my head. But if you take a minute to realize what was said, I have found that most of the time, it's not something I would say to myself. Not because it's a bad thing, but because it's a great thing. And usually my mind doesn't want to hear it. My thoughts, my inner voice, doesn't usually tell me to get up and tell Jesus about which of my neighbors. Get up and preach the word. Get up and do kids ministry, or nursery, or serving at your local church. Because sometimes those aren't things we think about when we join the body. We don't think that those things are important or necessary. So if that thought ever comes in your mind, the voice of Jesus speaking to you, listen to what it has to say. Listen to the things that it is speaking to your heart, right to your spirit. And then filter out the excuses. Filter out the things that stop us from getting up and saying, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." Tomorrow, we're going to look at the last hero of the faith who was called twice. So So join us tomorrow, and we'll finish the heroes of the faith who were called twice. I'll see you tomorrow.